Welcome to Inspire Me with Jay. This is a podcast to inspire, uplift, show forth the love of God, and help usher in the spiritual awakening. Welcome to Inspire Me with Jay. I'm your host, Jay Spillers, author and teacher. Please do like, subscribe, and share everywhere. I'm very excited today because we're going to do a part 2 on the first podcast we did about is World War III and Armageddon around the corner. And remember, we talked about how the various nations were converging on Israel in the Middle East. Russia, China, Iran is converging against Israel, and the U.S. is converging with Israel against Gaza and other Western nations. Remember, we had said that a lot of NDEers had seen World War III coming, but at least in one respect, it was good that they didn't think there was going to be a nuclear war. And one of the guys that was talking about how there probably wouldn't be a nuclear war, I found out later because I couldn't remember who it was Howard Storm. And Howard Storm has a very profound near-death experience. He went from being an atheist to being a Christian pastor after his near-death experience. He was a college professor and he had a profound NDE, met Christ on the other side, was told some pretty amazing things. But one of the things he was told about the end of the world was that there would not be a nuclear war, and that he saw a world eventually would come where there would be peace and people would be living in harmony and very simply, probably more communally, generally speaking. So, yeah, it was Howard Storm that was the one that said there would not be a nuclear war. Remember, also, we talked about Mellon Thomas Benedict was the one that's saying there was a place for war in the past, but the time of war had ended, and that nations that are gathering for war generally have ulterior motives like wealth or power, control, that they're not necessary in today's world. So I have an interesting fact that I learned since that first video that for me is going to be a game changer, and we're going to get to it in a few minutes. But let's just go on and look at a few things. One thing that God had planned was to bring Israel back into the land. And I do believe that this is true, because remember, after the Babylonian captivity, the Israelites were scattered, and there was somewhat of a return back to Israel, but then they were scattered again in 70 AD. But in the Old Testament, it talks about how God would regather the nation back, rebuild it, help it to flourish, set of statutes in place, and so forth. And I do believe that this is absolutely true. And I provided a link to an article that has several verses from the Old Testament that talk about the regathering of Israel. And there's even a verse or a few verses in the New Testament where Jesus was asked by someone, when will you restore Israel? And that was the whole point of the Messiah coming in their minds, was that he's going to restore Israel. So this idea that God would regather the diaspora of Israel back to the homeland has been there all along. Let me show you a quick verse. You can get this article in the link description. Let's just read Ezekiel 36, verse 24. For I will take you from among the nations and gather you out of all countries and bring you into your own land. So clearly we can see from these verses that God is going to regather his people. And this started happening even before 1948. It started in the late 19th, early 20th century and continued forth. And then, of course, after the Holocaust, there was the impetus to establish the nation of Israel. Now, there is a political philosophy or ideology, if you will, that developed in the late 19th century, even before World War II, that's called Zionism. And they did take the concept of God regathering Israel and create a political philosophy around it. And to some extent, they may have become very extreme in terms of what they wanted to do. And you can find Zionists that'll say, crazy things, and you'll see Zionism as a philosophy used to um, promote things that aren't necessarily good. And I don't claim to be a Zionist because I've heard the term that there's Jewish Zionists and Christian Zionists. I don't make any allegiance to Zionism or claim to be a Zionist. The only thing that I claim allegiance to is the Old Testament scriptures, which talks about the regathering of Israel. And much of what it says doesn't necessarily require everything that Zionist philosophers have put forward. So that's an important point. Keep in mind that Israel, for 2,000 years prior to 1948, had been under the control of some foreign power, whether it started with the Romans, the Arabs, the Ottomans, or in the 20th century, from about, I think, 1923 to 1948, it was the British. And at that time, it was called Mandatory Palestine. But Israel had been under the control of a foreign power for over 2,000 years. And now the Jews are starting to gather back into Israel, and the nation forms in 48. A struggle arises because, okay, well, you've got all the Jewish people coming home. It's a wonderful celebration. They're back in their homeland. They're rebuilding the land with things like the kibbutzes, which is like communal farming and agriculture, and everything's wonderful. And, we just came out of the Holocaust. So it's like everything's coming together and it seems great. But then there's this issue. There's already some people here called the Palestinians. So what happens here? And then, of course, there's been a 70 plus year struggle even before the nation of Israel about, well, what are we going to do here? And this struggle has obviously led to so much conflict, because both sides wanted the other side out. They wanted to drive them out or wipe them out or do something. And we've seen that Israel, as since 1967, took two territories, essentially controlled and occupied the West Bank and Gaza. And that's where most of the struggle's been. Because you have, like, in the West Bank, you've got essentially a military presence there. There's constant checks. There's been the confiscation of a lot of property of Palestinians and giving it to Israeli Jews. And you've got prolonged detentions for minor offenses. It feels very much like a police state. I mean, if you take it out of the context of Israel and the Palestinians, if you saw this going on in another country, what was going on in like the West Bank, you'd say, this looks like a police state. And you've got things like Gaza, where Gaza's constantly being attacked and, shelled. A lot of it's in relation to Hamas, of course, but like in this current war, there's the question of proportionality, because in any conflict or war, there's always a loss of civilian lives, and we recognize that. But something that might give you some perspective is there's been 14,000 Palestinian civilians killed since the start almost 2 months ago, and 5,000 of those were children. Now, 5,000 children over a 2 month period is quite a bit. And one thing that you can compare it to is like when Russia went into the Ukraine in that war, 500 children died in a 1 year period. So 10 times as many children have died in a much shorter period, just to give you a little bit of perspective. So this is the struggle. So, what is the ongoing solution to all this? And this is coming to the exciting part that I was wanting to focus on today. What is the solution? Who are the Palestinians and what are we going to do with them? This question of who the Palestinians are is a game changer because I just found out the answer myself. Remember that the area of Israel, Palestine, had been under control of foreign powers for over 2,000 years, whether it be the Romans, the Arabs, the Ottomans, or in the 20th century, it was the British, and what they called it was Mandatory Palestine, about 1923 to 1948, when Israel became a nation. So you had this control of foreign powers. Now, who are the Palestinians? Well, remember that part of the expulsion of the Jews happened in 70 AD, and they were pushed out because they revolted against the Romans. Well, there was a group of Palestinians who didn't participate in the revolt, and they were largely allowed to stay. Who were these Jews living in Palestine that did not revolt? Well, it was Jewish Christians primarily. Remember, the early church, when it first got started, was made primarily of Jews. It wasn't until like Acts chapter 10 when Peter got the vision to take the gospel to the Gentiles. And then, of course, later Paul came, who was the apostle to the Gentiles. But the church initially was primarily Jewish. And their numbers grew quite a bit. Like the church in Jerusalem was about 5,000. And some estimates say that the church could have gotten as high as 400,000, many of which were Jewish. Well, these, I believe, were the descendants of the Palestinians. This went on for quite a while, but when Islam came 6 centuries later, this area was conquered, and a lot of people were forced to convert to Islam. And there was a lot of intermarriage between the Palestinian Jews and the Arabs. But this, I believe, is the origins of the Palestinians. So they are effectively Jewish. And we're going to look at some information in a minute. But this could change everything because if you start to understand who the Palestinians are, that they are Jewish, they're native Jews that never left the area, they are essentially the same people as the diaspora that came back. So you have the Palestinian Jews and you have the Israeli Jews, but really they're both Jewish and they're both of Israel. And some people might say, well, they intermingled with Arabs and other peoples, and they probably have other lineages besides Jews. Well, that shouldn't really create a problem because most modern Jews today are a mixture of various peoples. Look at the Ashkenazi Jews, which is European Jews. They have as much as 50% European in their DNA. And I have a video on that. So if you're going to start ruling the Palestinians out because they're not 100% pure Jewish, you'd pretty much have to throw out every modern Jewish group there is. And it shouldn't really surprise you that modern Jews today are a mixture of other peoples, not exclusively coming from ancient Israel, because there's been a lot of intermarriages and conversions and whatnot. over the centuries. And from a biblical perspective, this isn't even really a problem because you see intermarriage and conversions going on all the time. In fact, the line of Jesus has Gentiles who converted and intermarried in, like Rahab and Ruth, and other examples in the Bible, like Joseph, who was taken into slavery and became just under Pharaoh, married the Pharaoh's daughters. So he himself had children who were uh, both Egyptian and Jewish. So this shouldn't really present a problem. Now, when you start to understand who these people are, who the Palestinians are, it puts everything in perspective because, well, what are we fighting about then? The hostility doesn't make any sense. The terrorism and the mistreatment should automatically stop because we're doing it to ourselves. And it answers the question on things like one state, two states. Well, we're all one. There's one Israel. There's one Israel Palestine. So when you start to understand all of this, it totally makes sense. And from a Christian perspective, obviously we love everybody. We're supposed to love all people. But there's a special place in our heart for Israel, right? For the Jewish people. Well, wouldn't that be doubly applied to the Palestinians in light of this information? Because they're of Jewish descendancy, but they also, secondly, are made up of people. They also descend from people who literally may have sat under the feet of Christ and at the feet of the apostles, learning from Jesus and his apostles. So they are descendants of the first Christians. And it's like, wow, it's just mind blowing to think about. I know a lot of Christian evangelicals, we're like pro Israel and we kind of get a negative view of the Palestinians, blah, 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 blah. But when you start to understand it, it's like, whoa, the Palestinians are Jewish too, and they descend most likely from the early Christians. They're they're the people that studied under Jesus himself. It's just mind blowing when you think about it. I want to show you some evidence for this. This is from a Wikipedia article called The Origins of the Palestinians, and it's got numerous footnotes and sightings that you can go and research further. See if first one here is from what the Palestinians in their oral traditions say about themselves, or at least some of them. And let's find the spot I'm looking for. Yeah, here it is. The second paragraph, it starts, some Palestinians, right here. Some Palestinian families follow oral traditions that trace their roots to Jewish and Samaritan origins. Traditions of Jewish ancestry are especially prevalent in the southern Hebron Hills, a region with documented Jewish presence until the Islamic conquest. There you go. This is in their oral traditions and it says that they came from Samaritan too. But remember, who are the Samaritans? The Samaritans were people that were intermixed with Israelites, the 10 lost tribes, and other peoples. And then they came back into the land and they weren't fully accepted by Jews at the time of Christ. But they themselves are partly Israelites. So they have a little bit of Jewish and Samaritan slash Israelite blood. Because remember, the Jewish people make up two of the tribes, they don't make up the entire nation. And that's an interesting point, too, is that God said he would call Israel back, he would call all of his people. So there's more than just the Jewish people that are ultimately out there in the world. And I do believe there was a few tribes that have come back that were of different tribes, like Simon and Reuben. They found a couple um, of those groups in India, and they've since migrated to Israel. It's not a huge amount, but so there's other peoples out there. And surprisingly enough, the Kurds may actually be part of the 10 lost tribes of Israel too, because they are genetically closer to the Jews than most regular Arabs. So they're probably part of the lost tribe of Israel. They have Kurdistan and aren't really interested in going to Israel, but it's just an interesting point. So the Palestinians have oral traditions pointing themselves back to their Jewish roots. Let's go to the next one. Next one is going to be from What Do the Jews Say About Themselves? Um, let's see, where is it? Okay, here it is. This is talking from the Zionists. Remember, we talked about the Zionists came in the mid to late 19th century and went from there. But this was written by the very early Zionists. Probably this might have been like late 19th century, early 20th century, sometime before Britain, because it makes reference to pre mandate times, which was 1923 on of Britain. But let's see what some of these Zionist Jews have to say about we're thinking about the Palestinians. It says a number of pre-mandatory Zionists from Ehad Aram bin Borakov to David ben Gurion and Zitnak ben Zivi, sorry, I'm butchering the names, believe that the Palestinian peasants population, as descended from the ancient biblical Hebrews, but this belief was disowned when its ideological implications became problematic. Did you get all that? They they believed that the Palestinians were ancient Hebrews. They were the same people. They were the Israelites, the Jews, just like them. But for ideological reasons, they ruled it out. And see, that's an important point that I was making, that I believe the ancient scriptures. I don't necessarily affirm the political or ideology of Zionism. Okay, Zionism may have a root truth to it, but I don't claim allegiance to that whole philosophy. And this is part of it right here. They know, they believe that the Palestinians are Jewish, but they rule it out. And we'll get to it in a minute as to probably why they did. Now, this is going back before DNA testing, what the Jews were saying and what the Palestinians were saying in their own traditions and research. So, what does the DNA say? Because now we have DNA testing that further collaborates what was already out there, what was already believed. And one thing to bear in mind is that the Palestinians and the Jewish people are closer to each other than anyone else. So the Palestinians, like the Kurds, are genetically closer to the Jews than other Arab groups. And this is what one geneticist has to say. This is fascinating. One DNA study by Nebel found substantial genetic overlap among Israeli Palestinian Arabs and Jews. Nebel proposed that part or perhaps the majority of Muslim Palestinians descended from local inhabitants, mainly Christians and Jews, who had converted after the Islamic conquest in the 7th century AD. There you have it. You have what the Palestinian oral traditions say, what the Jewish people had found in their own research, and what the DNA is saying. They're the same people, they're brothers. This whole conflict between Israel and Palestine, in one respects, is insane. It's profound ignorance on both sides. And it's just mind blowing that virtually nobody knows this today. And we're about to go to Armageddon based on profound ignorance. You know, it's just insane. And it's like, okay, well, you think about all nations going to be coming against Israel. Well, how is that possible? It's possible, even though, the US and certain Western nations are on Israel's side, because this is essentially a civil war. This is a civil war, and people don't even know it. And it doesn't matter which side you pick. You pick the Palestinians, you pick the Israeli Jews, you're going against Israel. You're going against Israel, the people. And remember, that's the important part, is that we're for the people, not for government entities and all of that stuff. So either way you pick it, you're going against Israel. And a lot of times Christians like to use the verse in Genesis 12:3 that says, where God said to Abraham, I will bless those that bless you and curse those that curse you. It doesn't matter. If you support one side militarily, you give arms, you send your armies, your military there. For one side or the other, you're cursed. You're going against Israel. Either way you do it, you're cursed. You can't win that one. You can't win by supporting one side militarily over another. So, what are we supposed to do as non-Israelites, coming from other parts of the world looking in, as Christians, as anybody? Well, the reality is we should be pushing for peace. We should be seeking unity. We should be seeking compassion on both sides. We should be speaking the truth, which I'm sharing right now, and helping them to unite. But certainly in no way should we be militarily involved on either side, because that's cursed either way you go on that one. So what's really the conflict here? Why can't the Palestinians and the Jews just unite? Well, you're probably thinking the same thing I am. It's probably over religion, because the Palestinians were forced to convert centuries ago, primarily to Islam. And that's a big issue. But when you look at it in terms of how do you immigrate to Israel, you can get in usually through a couple paths, either by converting to Judaism or by being genetically Jewish, you know. So those are sort of like two tracks. Now, there's been a conflict because there are people who are genetically Jewish, but are like Messianic Jews or Jewish Christians, and they've been denied entry into Israel, even though they're genetically Jewish. You could come in as an atheist to Israel if you're genetically Jewish, but you can't be a Jewish Christian or a Messianic Jew. So there's some contradiction there. And obviously, if they're not going to accept Jewish Christians, they're not going to accept Messianic Jews. They're probably not going to accept any type of Islamic Jew, which would be most of the Palestinians. So, in order to facilitate the reuniting of the two people, there has to be some kind of change on that law. There has to be some kind of inclusion of Palestinians as Jews and brought into the larger Israeli community. And, that's obviously probably not going to be an easy task. And of course, you have issues of how the two religious groups can get along. Well, this is something interesting. I just found out Israel doesn't even have a formal constitution, but they're working on it. I asked Alexa this yesterday, and she was saying they're working on it. Well, here's the thing is that you need to get a constitution for all of Israel, including Gaza, West Bank, and Israel proper, that guarantees religious liberty, that guarantees freedom, that guarantees the rights of all people and all of that. And it has to be written very tightly and so forth. And I think another thing that probably could be of significance is you have to have a decentralized governance. So there's considerable amount of autonomy for the different groups. So Gaza can remain semi-autonomous and the West Bank can, and all of the things where you're trying to give land in the West Bank to Israeli Jews over Palestinian Jews. Well, that all stuff has to stop. You need to, stop having it like a police state with, soldiers everywhere and all of that. The people have to be integrated. And it's like you have to be able to easily move within the different areas, whether you're going from Gaza to Israel proper to West Bank, whatever, and everybody has to be equal in that sense. And what's the problem? They're all Jewish, But and when you look at Islam, I've heard one Islamic person say that Islam is just basically Judaism with a universal mandate, that it's a universal mandate to go and share the message of Islam with people. And I think that's largely true. It's like an Arabized version of Judaism. The two religions are very similar. And if you start to understand that, it's like, okay, well, maybe the Muslims are just kind of a variation of Judaism. If you could kind of start to see it that way, that might help to ease some of the tension a bit. Um, Obviously, one thing that'll have to come is the return of Christ, because when Christ returns, he will fulfill all of the of both religions, all religions really, but he will fulfill Judaism. He will be their Messiah that they're looking for. He will fulfill Islam, that, yes, I'm a prophet, but I'm more than a prophet. I'm the Son of God who took your sins on the cross. So he'll complete Islam. And it'll be kind of interesting because Jesus will complete both religions, Islam and Judaism, but then he'll look to both groups, like in Israel, to the Palestinian Jews and to the Israeli Jews, and say, you are one. You are one people. You are both of Israel. And I think that it'll bridge them together. But I mean, I think probably at first it'll probably be like, when Darth Vader told Luke Skywalker, I am your father, there'll be like a moment of, turning white as a ghost, like, what did you say? You know, but it's true, you know, they are one people. It's going to be an amazing thing. There's the scriptures in Romans 11 that talks about all of Israel being saved. And we always think in the spiritual sense of, all of Israel coming to their Messiah. And I believe that's absolutely true. I believe it's true past, present, and future, not just for Israel at that time when Christ comes back, but all of Israel, past, present, future. But there's something even beyond the spiritual reality to that. Could there be a restorative reality to where different groups start to realize, oh, I'm part of the Jewish people too, even though I've lost my identity, or like in the case of the Kurds or some of these other groups, oh, my people are actually part of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. we fit into to Israel too, because that's the whole point of Israel, is that all of Israel is going to be reunited, not just the Jewish people. So you'll have a lot of that going on. And of course, you'll have the Palestinians like, oh, I'm part of Israel too. I'm part of the Jewish people myself. So it's like all of Israel will be restored and the eyes will be open and people will see um, who they really are and who their brothers and sisters really are. And I think it's just going to be amazing. Now, obviously, some of this may not be fulfilled until Christ returns, but we can still speak the truth. We can still point people to the truth as best we can. And thank God for DNA testing because we're starting to find out some amazing things through the DNA research. A lot of wrong ideas are being exposed. I'll give you another example. There's this Kaiser theory or whatever that the Jews are not really Jews and that they come exclusively from other people like the Ashkenazis. And DNA testing proves that it's not true. Yes, they have a lot of European mixture in with them, but they have a strong, definite root back to ancient Israel, just like all the other Jewish groups do. And that DNA also disproves some of the things like, well, maybe Western Europe is part of the 10 lost tribes. And that the DNA's pretty much shot that idea down. British Israelitism, Christian identity, they're just not true. And the DNA has shown that. But there are the 10 lost tribes out there, and we are finding groups that are extremely genetically close to the Jewish people, like the Kurds, for example, and the Palestinians. But we'll just go ahead and conclude for today. Thank you and subscribe. I'll see you in the next episode. Are you looking for a devotional that will radically transform your walk with Christ and revolutionize the world at the same time? Check out my latest book, Walk as Children of the Light. This book focuses on everything you need to be fully equipped and discipled in Christ: prayer, meditation, scripture, love, gratitude, and much, much more. Available on Amazon, 5-star rating.